Hello, my name is Matt. I'm a This Institute PhD fellow, and today I'll be talking about mixed methods in healthcare research. So, when we think about research problems in healthcare, they can be very complex. Mixed method approaches can help relieve some of this complexity by combining the quantitative and the qualitative approaches. Researchers come to problems in different ways and provide a deeper understanding of what's going on above and below the water. So, for example, in this image, you see there's lots going on above, lots going on below, lots of people trying to get at that problem. And you should all have seen mixed methods research in sort of the recent history, but you might not have been aware of it. So throughout the pandemic, mixed method research was going on with studies such as the REACT study. So this was designed to track the prevalence and the spread of COVID-19 in the community, provide insights to inform public health responses. On the quantitative side, the study collected large-scale data from across millions of participants, providing information on the infection rates, the antibody presence, and geographic spread of the virus. This gave policymakers real-time data and the ability to understand how COVID-19 was moving through different populations. However, understanding the numbers is only part of the story. So the REACT study aimed to incorporate some qualitative study research to delve deeper into the public's understanding of their behaviours and experiences of COVID-19. So interviews and surveys were used to gather information on the vaccine hesitancy, compliance, and lockdown measures and how these could be addressed through different public health measures and quantify some of the impact of the pandemic. This is important as by integrating these quantitative testing data and the qualitative insights, the REACT study could provide a more complete picture of the impact of COVID-19. It didn't just measure the spread of the virus, but it also explored the underlying psychosocial factors driving the spread, which could help tailor some public health interventions more effectively. So what is mixed methods research? So mixed methods research is the combination of qualitative and quantitative approaches, and this allows researchers to gain a broader and a deeper understanding of the problem at hand and drawing on some of the strengths of both of those approaches. And importantly, this is not just at the data collection level, but actually mixing can occur at all different stages, from inception to analysis and then on to reporting at the end of the study. And this can be through a single study, or it can be through a series of studies to try and understand this research problem better. So let's get into some of the nitty-gritty, some of them break down some of these terms. So qualitative research tends to focus on words and observations, interpretation of those findings, trying to answer why type questions, whereas quantitative data focuses more on how many and involves a lot of numbers and often uses larger sample sizes when it's sort of producing these hypotheses. Being able to combine these different approaches together helps better contextualize the findings in the sort of wider picture and why these certain issues happen, but also how they're happening in process. And it helps capture multiple perspectives to try and triangulate or corroborate the different findings with the different aspects of study. And that's better to sort of prove or disprove any hypotheses that we might be drawing on. So mixed methods is a useful tool in healthcare research, and I'll be using my PhD as an example of how mixed methods can be used in clinical research. So the aim of my PhD is to understand the factors that influence prescribing practices of tolvaptan for a disease called autosomal dominant polycystic kidney disease. So this is also known as ADPKD. So ADPKD is a rare inherited condition which leads to the development of many cysts in the kidneys and ultimately kidney failure. And tolvaptan is the only disease-modifying medication that's available for treating this condition, but it has some serious side effects. So understanding the prescribing practices that relate to this medication and disease is important to make sure that the right people get the medication and the wrong people don't. So for this study, I'm using a mixed method approach, which has a qualitative residual analysis design, and I'll get into what some of this method and approach involves over the next few slides. So firstly, why did I choose a mixed method approach? Well, ADPKD is a rare disease. It only affects about 1 in 2,000 of the population. So this means databases tend to have not particularly large numbers of patients on them. Prescribing decisions are very complex, and often these decisions aren't well documented in the notes. And the care for these patients is dispersed across the UK. So this makes research a little bit more difficult than it would be otherwise. So conducting qualitative or quantitative research approaches on their own might not fully answer the question that we want, which is why is there variation in prescribing practices? So in my study, this is taking the design of a qualitative residual analysis, and it has the following components. So there's an analysis of the database, which is to try and identify centres that are outliers in terms of their prescribing practices. These centres are then approached to be included in a multiple case study where we attend the different sites and then conduct some qualitative research to try and get at why this variation is occurring. We then use that information to plug into a practice survey and get a bit more information about why these factors are different in the different centres and enable us to reanalysis the database with that newfound knowledge. So in a nutshell, it's trying to help build a greater picture of prescribing practices in the UK. And the qualitative approach is allowing us to understand why this practice is occurring, whereas the quantitative is giving us a bit more detail about exactly how it's occurring in practice. So this is one of the first stages of the quantitative component to the qualitative residual analysis. And this clues kind of in the name, residual analysis. So residual analysis is usually to do with regression. So on this, we're using funnel plots to map out the prescribing practices that are observed versus what we'd expect for the size of the unit. As you can see, there's some green and pink lines that are on the outside, and these refer to the different standard deviations. So any points that are beyond these lines are outliers. They're not sort of within the normal realms of variation. As you can see, there's 6 different centres that I've circled that are outside of this practice. And these are centres that would then be of interest to try and investigate the variation further. So 3 of these have been selected, and they're the ones that we're approaching in the study. This is partly to avoid having to do lots of large numbers, which in a multiple case study is not particularly helpful and can be very, very time consuming. These different cases were selected mainly to sort of emphasize variation in practice, but you could also have picked 3 cases that are all clumped together, and that would try and give a bit more information about practices that they're doing similar and what might lead to these similarities rather than the differences. So as I mentioned, the plan is to then attend these hospitals. So at these 3 hospitals, there'll be multiple components. So there's going to be an interview of healthcare professionals. There's going to be observations of prescribing practice in the clinic room, and then analysis of the documents that they use to inform their decision making. And this should provide a detailed understanding of their practices and why it's occurring as it is in the different centres. But this isn't the only way to conduct mixed methods research. There are many different combinations of the qualitative and quantitative components. Some of them I've listed here, and we'll go through them on the next couple of slides with a brief example. So the first is sequential exploratory. So this is where you've got a qualitative followed by a quantitative component. An example of this is collecting diary entries and then analysing them for themes. And then those themes are put into a survey, which can be then distributed to get the quantitative data out of it. You can have a sequential explanatory approach. So this is where you have quantitative followed by qualitative data analysis or collection. So an example of this would be having the survey or a database analysis to identify participants that you then go and speak to in a focus group or an interview. You can have a concurrent. So this is where you've got simultaneous qualitative and quantitative components going on, and then you compare and contrast the results from them. So that would be if you were collecting survey data, but at the same time you were collecting interview responses and then putting them all together and comparing them at the end. And then finally, it could be multi-phase. So this is like my PhD, so where you've got a series of different sequential components, each informing the next. So you could have database analysis, which identifies the participants. You then go to those participants and do some qualitative like focus groups or interviews. And then you return back to the database analysis with new variables to investigate further. So there can be lots of different aims for these different mixed methods. So it could be that you're wanting to triangulate, which is using both methods to converge and validate results and reduce bias. It could be that you're trying to complement, which is seeking to sort of elaborate or clarify one method using the other method. It could be to develop, which is using the results from one method to sort of help or inform the other method. So that could be through sampling or through implementation or measurement. Or you could be expanding, so extending the breadth and the range of inquiry by using different methods. And there's lots of different ways that you can get this data. So another positive is that you can use all these different methods that are available to you. So these would typically be restricted to qualitative or quantitative approaches to research, but with mixed method, because you're using both, you get access to a greater data collection method. So I've listed some of the potential methods on here. So ones that are sort of associated with qualitative usually are things like the interviews, focus groups, observations, whereas quantitative ones would be more things like surveys, experiments, and tests. And this isn't a new thing. So one of the most famous early examples of mixed methods research comes from John Snow, who during the 1854 cholera outbreak in London was practicing mixed methods research. So Snow was a doctor that was determined to find the source of this outbreak and used a sequential exploratory approach to do this. So he first began observing patterns in the outbreak and started interviewing residents of this local area. And through these qualitative interviews, he learned about what water sources that they were using, and that gave him an insight into the potential causes for the cholera. His observations then allowed him to hypothesize that the outbreak might be related to one particular water pump, which was on Broad Street. And then to support this hypothesis, he used quantitative methods and statistical analysis to produce a detailed map of the cholera cases, plotting the locations where people had died and their proximity to the water pump. And by integrating these qualitative and quantitative components, he was able to find a compelling evidence that the Broad Street pump was the source of the outbreak. And this use of mixed methods not only was was solving a critical health problem at the time, but also was laying the groundwork for modern epidemiology research. So we've spoken a lot about the different aspects between qualitative and quantitative. So qualitative research focuses on why-type questions involving smaller samples oftenly, and commonly this data is collected through observations or interviews. Quantitative research centers on how many and uses larger data sets to try and make measurements and test different hypotheses. We've spoken about how these different approaches can be combined together and the benefits in doing so. And we've seen some examples of mixed methods research in the distant past, the recent past, and the current. So in conclusion, the mixed methods research approach can offer a flexible and comprehensive approach to healthcare research. It combines the strengths of both qualitative and quantitative methods and enables us to better understand complex healthcare problems. Thank you for listening to me. I'd like to acknowledge my PhD supervisors, which are James Fotheringham and Alicia O'Cathan, both at the University of Sheffield, just for their ongoing support during my PhD.